You've already mentioned sexual relations and the changes they were undergoing, and it seemed to me that from the book that Freud was one of the sort of intellectual figures who loomed large in the period he was coming to prominence in this decade. And you say that neurosis became a leading idea not only in fiction, which you talk about, but also in medicine. I mean, is Freud one of the sort of key figures, do you think, to understanding the intellectual climate of the period?
Yes, he is in an ironic way, because Freud himself, of course, forswore studying philosophy and became a doctor instead because he wanted to be a proper scientist, which is the one thing he never became. Though I think as a cultural philosopher, his thinking can be very powerful, his analysis can be very powerful. He himself did not claim that he had made any particularly new discovery, but I think the fact that, as he himself said, we are not master in our own house, that basically rationality does not control us, but that there are other darker, less understandable, less accessible forces and drives that control us and that make us do certain things. Also, the fact that he identified these things as basically sexual, that is very important. And that is a partial analysis that I think can carry quite far.
One of I think probably the most shocking thing for me in the book was your chapter on the events in the Belgian Congo and
yes, that is horrible.
The terrible exploitation of the native people there in order to enrich the Belgian king with revenues from rubber. And I wondered if you saw, I mean, you've sort of talked about sort of foreshadowings, if in those events it seemed to me there were foreshadowings of some of the very dark events which were to follow in the 20th century and genocides and other events like that.
Of course there is. I mean, but also let's not forget that the word concentration camp was invented during the Boer War, also of that period, when the English locked up, the English army locked up scores, I mean, tens of thousands of women and children and basically let them die. But I think there is simply a difference in scale, and I also think that is, you know, what sets the 20th century here apart is not a new degree of wickedness, but a new degree of technological feasibility.
Yes,
there have always been genocidal killers in history, people who wanted to commit genocides, but it's a lot more difficult to do that with swords than with, you know, technological means and trains and timetables and gas chambers and so. The difference here is not that the 20th century has developed a unique degree of wickedness, but it simply, unfortunately, it developed industrial means that allowed doing what other people had already tried to do on a vastly different scale.
I think the other interesting characteristic which you write about in that regard is mass communication, the rapidity of transmission of information, the mass media, newspapers. It was no longer possible by the early 20th century to commit genocide and for no one in the wider world to be aware of it.
No, exactly. And of course, you know, all of a sudden this mass communication obeys media rules, which means that, you know, in the media, what gets the most coverage is not necessarily what is the most important for most people, but simply what captures the imagination most, or what sells most newspapers. It is simply that certain things capture the imagination. And that, of course, means that you get a different kind of reality. You get a different kind of perceived reality. That was important, for instance, for feminists or for the suffragettes in Britain. There weren't that many of them. But if one of these women, nice middle-class women, went on a hunger strike in jail, it was a huge media event. The media covered it breathlessly, day by day. If there was a lesbian photographer, I'm thinking of a particular activist in Germany, who had her hair cropped short and wrote tracts and did sport in public, you know, that she was just one woman and she may have annoyed her neighbors in Munich. But as a matter of fact, she captured the imagination of the newspapers and she became a national figure. And so people could have an influence vastly above what they could have had a generation before.
One of the great riches and attractions of the book, for me, Philipp, was the number of authors that you introduced me to and the number of books that I now want to go and try and find and read. And I wondered if you made a great many discoveries in reading the literature of the period yourself.
Oh, I made a huge amount of discoveries, and I think that is one of the joys of writing something like that. And I have worked on the period before, but of course, in a book as panoramic as that, I mean, it is always a perilous thing to do because you can't be an expert on everything. But that, of course, means that you personally have the joy to discover a great amount of things simply while reading. I mean, one of the great discoveries, for instance, that I'd always been sort of hovering on the horizon, but I'd never got around to reading, is Andre Bailey's brilliant novel Petersburg,
Yes.
which must be one of the great novels of that period and probably of the 20th century. A wonderful work that is practically unknown today. And he didn't produce much else of note, but yes, you do get wonderful surprises like that. It is such a rich time, and I think what the great opportunity of work like this is that you can basically share this wealth around a little bit because you get paid finding it.